Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here today to offer some distraction in the form of a book haul revisit. In the US, we are post-election right now, and I will be honest, I had been thinking that I was going to take the rest of the week off. I wasn't even sure that I wanted to do a Friday Reads video this week, just to have some time, but yesterday, I'm filming this on Thursday. So Wednesday, the day after the election, I got a lot of comments on the video that Joel and I did earlier in the week that posted on election day, where we did our reading wrap up for the month of October. And a lot of people said that they found it comforting and helpful to have a distraction. So I figured, here, why not? Just do it. Offer some distraction, and we don't have to talk about politics any more than that. Just, here is some distraction in the form of a book haul revisit that is really not going to go well for me. So if you're unfamiliar, I got the idea of book haul revisits from Doris at Aldi Books. She, for a while, was doing book haul revisits where she was looking back at book hauls that she had done, I think 3 years in the past at that point, to see how many of the books she had read and how many she still wanted to read. I thought it was a very intriguing idea, so I started doing it, and I do it every month. And I have been doing book hauls since 2019. So what is that? 5 years of book hauls? I'm not good at math. And we're going to look back at all of my book hauls from the month of November and see how many of the books I've read, how many I still want to read, how many I have gotten rid of, and maybe I'll think about ones that I might get rid of in the future. The metric that I have decided is important here, because in doing this, I am hopefully making myself a more intentional book purchaser. The metric that I have really zeroed in on is not the amount of books that I have unhauled, but the books that I unhauled without reading. That is sort of my watch out statistic. I originally called it a fail rate, like books that I purchased and then ultimately got rid of without reading. But I don't want to think of it as a fail rate. I just think that those are indicators that maybe I should consider things a little bit differently when purchasing books, and it'll maybe change my behaviors. My typical disclaimer is that in order to make this video shorter and not just ridiculously long, I have gone back to the original book hauls, which will all be linked down below, by the way. I have removed any books that were purchased for my Pulitzer Project, and that includes books by Pulitzer authors, although I am leaving one in here because it was purchased before I decided to collect all of the books that have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and also purchased other books by authors who have won a Pulitzer Prize. So I've removed anything for the Pulitzer Project. I have removed anything that was gifted to me or because I didn't spend money on it. Really, I'm trying to hold myself accountable for things that I spent money on. And even that is a bit of a tricky concept because we'll get into it. But I've removed anything that was gifted to me. I have removed library builders, which are cases where I purchased a book to complete an author collection or something similar to that. I have gotten rid of books that I had already read when I purchased them, because basically that's different from spending money on a book with the intention of reading it. I read it and I liked it enough that I knew I wanted to have a copy in my library. So it's a very different thing. And I will also not be spending time in this book haul revisit talking about what these books are about. If you want more information, I will link the original book hauls down below. I talk about the description. I read a little bit from the opening, all of that stuff. So you may refer to the description box for all of that. Now, let's dive in. Usually, the trend in my book haul revisits is that the further back you go, the bigger the book hauls get. Because when I originally started having my channel, I was really excited and just started buying books. Also, at that time, finances were pretty good. And finances have gotten a little tighter over the years. So that has also impacted my trend. And it's part of why I want to be a more intentional book purchaser. But this book haul is the opposite. We're going to start, by the way, with the most recent book haul and work our way back in time. So we're going to look at November of 2023. And this is by far the largest book haul to look back at that I'm going to be covering today. The book hauls get much smaller as we go back. I brought 17 books into my library in November of last year that count for our purposes today. And at the time, it was my biggest book haul ever, but my October book haul actually surpassed it by a lot. I'll link that one down below as well. I will also link the video that Joel and I did earlier this week if you need even more distraction. So the reason it's so large is that the Fort Missoula, the historical museum that operates on Fort Missoula, does a book sale every year. They actually did it last weekend, the same weekend as Halloween, like leading into November. And we were not able to go for various reasons. But I went last year and I got a lot of these books. Now, this is where the amount of money spent on books that I'm looking at in my book hauls is something I have been thinking about a lot, because everything that I got at that book sale was ridiculously cheap. It's one of those things where you pay them $10 and they give you a paper bag, and you can put as many books as you can fit into that paper bag. And I left, and because I actually went on the last day, they didn't care about that. Like, I filled my bag and they said, "Do you just want another bag? We just want to get rid of these books." And I took the other bag. So I got a lot of books for $10. That means that individually, they're ridiculously cheap. But the first book we're going to talk about is something I bought full priced as a hardcover. And I don't really know how to account for that in this. It's just something I'm thinking about, because holding yourself accountable for something that you spent less than $1 on, because for $10 you got a bunch of books, and holding yourself accountable for something that this particular hardcover was $27, that's very different. But I'm going to do it anyway, because I did spend money on it, and that's the metric I've decided is what I'm using. And maybe going forward, because next year I'll have an additional year of book hauls. So maybe next year I might try to account for, like, if I spent $1 on a book, it's not that earth-shattering if I don't read it or if I get rid of it later. But when I spend $27 on a book and don't read it or unhaul it later, that's where it starts to be difficult. So just to loop you in, that's a type of thinking that I am going through, specifically because of November of last year. Now, let's just get into it. That first book that I was talking about is Witness by Jamel Brinkley. This is a story collection. It is something that had jumped out to me as really interesting sounding. I was thinking it could potentially be a Pulitzer contender. That turned out not to be true at all. And I had also been thinking that it might be a contender for some year-end best of lists, and that turned out not to be true either. However, I am still interested in reading this book, and I don't know when I will get around to it, because the urgency has really died down, especially since my predictions that this would be a potential contender for the Pulitzer Prize, that it would end up on year-end best list, really turned out not to be true. The urgency kind of went low, but it's not going to be going anywhere. I'm going to hold on to it, and we'll see if and when I ultimately get around to reading it. But yeah, I'm specifically thinking about this one because spending $27 on a book and not reading it is a very different situation than a lot of the other things that we will be looking at in this revisit. Then there is So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan. This is another thing that was a new release in November of last year. This hardcover is $20. It's a tiny little thing. So again, spending $20 on a book, very different from some stuff that we're going to be looking at later. And there is just like a little stain on the cover, and I keep playing with it. Anyway, I did read this. So this is one of the rare success stories that we're going to have in this book haul revisit. I mentioned that, like, you can get some distraction by watching me fail at a book haul revisit. So this is one of the rare success stories that we're going to get. I have been a fan of Claire Keegan. I love Foster, which will be coming up later. I love Small Things Like These, and she has other story collections that had been released before Small Things Like These that are available in the US, and I am very interested in reading them. So I did purchase this. It was a new release at the time, and I read it immediately in a single afternoon because it is so short, and it's 3 short stories. So a rare success story in this book haul revisit. Then we have The Lost Journals of Sacajewea by Debra Magpie Earling. Chelsea from Montana Book Company was a huge fan of this book, and Debra Magpie Earling is a Montana author, so there's a local connection to where I live. And I had also been thinking that this would be a sort of dark horse contender for the Pulitzer because, Sacajewea, it's a quintessentially American story, and it showed up in some interesting areas last year in terms of like end of year best lists that made me think it could be a dark horse contender. It has a blurb on the front from Morgan Talty. I just noticed that right now. And I do still want to read this, but I have not read it. And this, again, is a hardcover that I bought as a new release for $26. So we're going to start getting into the books that I got much cheaper, but like these are the prime contenders, like the most expensive books that I spent money on, and I've only read 1 out of 3. So lots of work to be done there. However, I'm still really interested in reading the 2 that I haven't gotten to. And it is what it is. Then we have By the Lake by John McGahern. I had been compiling a list of Irish authors I might want to get to before going to Ireland at this time last year. We went in May. And John McGahern was mentioned in a book that I read, I think in October of last year, by Nuala O'Foylan, her memoir. And she mentioned him. I think she dated him for a time. And I became very interested in his work. And a lot of it is sort of difficult to find in the United States. And when I say that, because people always will be like, oh, I looked online and it's available. It's like, yes, it's available. But if you just walk into a bookstore, you're not likely to find it. If you walk into used bookstores, you might find something, but it's a bit of a search. So that's what I mean when I say that. Like if you go online, you will find John McGahern books that you can purchase, but difficult to find in stores, and the availability is not that high. I did find By the Lake at my local used bookstore, and I grabbed it. And I did not manage to read it before we left, but I figured in Ireland, I would probably find the John McGahern books that I was most interested in, and I got Amongst Women. I read it while we were in Ireland, and I loved that book. So part of me was thinking, it's like, well, I read the book of his that I really wanted to get to, so do I need this one anymore? That thought process could happen. However, I really loved Amongst Women, so I want to read more of his books. So this is not going to be going anywhere, but I have not read it. And I got that at my local used bookstore. So that was cheap. William Trevor, same deal as John McGahern. William Trevor is a renowned short story author, so I figured he's Irish, and for that reason, I wanted to read him before we got there. And I did read him, I want to say, in March. This is the one that I read. So another rare success story in this book haul revisit. I read these stories. They were good. I'm not going to try to spend a lot of time talking about what I thought of the books that I have read, but we're going to get to another William Trevor book later on. I don't know why I separated them, but he's an author I would be looking to explore more. Telephone by Percival Everett showed up at my local used bookstore, and I grabbed a copy because Percival Everett, at the time I had not read one of his books. I have read James now, and he's an author I want to explore more. Telephone is the book that he became a Pulitzer Prize finalist for. It's the book that he published before The Trees, which is the book that really launched him into the stratosphere and made him a very popular author. So I have not read it yet, but I have read a Percival Everett book, and I am very much looking forward to, at some point, exploring more of his fiction, so this one will not be going anywhere. I'll probably read The Trees before I read Telephone, but because there is that Pulitzer connection, I'm going to be interested in it as well. Then we have The Color of Water, a black man's tribute to his white mother by James McBride. I am a huge fan of James McBride. You can see The Good Lord Bird faced out on my shelf. I mention it every time I mention James McBride. I love that book. The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store is also a book I really love. And this is a memoir of his. I have not read it yet, but it has been highly recommended. Doris from Aldi Books, speaking of her, is a big fan of The Color of Water. So I would like to get around to reading it at some point. And I admit, I feel like I'm much more likely to listen to this on audio. But because I know that I like James McBride, I'm fine holding on to the book. And I'm willing to bet that even if I do listen to the audio, I will probably want a copy of it in my library. So it will not be going anywhere. Then we have Torch Song Trilogy by Harvey Fierstein. This is one of those books that I got for ridiculously cheap. I think this was like $1. It might even be one of the books that I found at that book sale. I did not go back and watch last year's book haul to see where the delineation is and where the books that I got at the book sale started, because if I did, then I probably got it for less than $1. But I found this, and I got it because it is a queer history piece. I've never seen Torch Song Trilogy. I've never seen it performed. I have not read it. So this is a hardcover edition of it. So I almost took this out because to me, this is like a fun collectible thing, but I will read it. That's ultimately why I kept it in, because I do want to read it. It won the 1983 Tony Award for Best Play. I like reading plays, and they also read very quickly. So I'm going to hold on to it. I'm including it because I do actually really want to read it, even though the reason I purchased it is that it is a really cool book to have, I think. So, haven't read it yet, but would still like to. Then we have Rules of Civility by Amor Towles. And I had been gifted a bunch of books last year, and I think this might have actually been one of them. But because I don't remember, I'm just going to throw it in. And because Amor Towles is an author I would really like to read at some point. He's an author where I feel like everybody who has read him has a different favorite book. A lot of them are either The Lincoln Highway or A Gentleman in Moscow. But there are Rules of Civility fans out there. This is the book that put him on my radar. I was working for a holiday season at Barnes & Noble the year that this was released, and I heard so many good things about it, and I've heard so many good things about Amor Towles in the years since it was published. So it is something that I will hold on to and get around to at some point. And I just can't remember if it was something that was gifted to me or not. This definitely came from that book sale. This is Bless Me Ultima by Rodolfo Anaya. And again, I got it for really cheap, but you know, it is something that I would really like to read, and for that reason, it kind of makes sense to just include it. And I don't know when I'll get to it. This is kind of like a library builder. It's a classic book that I haven't read and I consistently hear good things about. So I'll get to it someday. I just don't know when. I don't have immediate plans to get to it. It'll just kind of happen when it happens. Now, this is an interesting one. I'm pretty sure this also came from that book sale. The Beggar Maid by Alice Munro. Now, around this time last year, news was breaking about Alice Munro, who did pass away. So after her death, it came out, a controversy came out. I don't want to get into specifics. You can Google it if you want. And that has really made Alice Munro a complicated figure for a lot of people. And again, I don't really want to get sidetracked by that. I think I will still read her at some point. And I am not trying to say that you should not read Alice Munro. I'm not saying you should read Alice Munro, but she has become an author where for a lot of people, you might want to think about if you want to engage in her work, and maybe knowing about the controversy might change your perception of her work. So I am going to hold on to this book. I will probably get around to it at some point, but I'm definitely going to hold off and think about it. So we'll see. Here is the other William Trevor book. This is Two Lives. I believe this is I was going to call them novellas, but it looks longer than a novella length. It's 373 pages, so I guess it would be novella that have been published together, and I'm going to hold on to them because I liked the stories in Last Stories enough that I would definitely do more of his work. So I haven't read it yet, but I would like to. Anne Patchett had talked about how one of her favorite books of all time is The Leopard by Giuseppe de Lampedusa. This is translated by Archibald Colquhoun. I don't know how to pronounce that name, so I'm just going to hold it up and let you see it. I always want to mention the translator. So this is actually something that I found at that book sale after Anne Patchett talked about it being one of her all-time favorite books and a quintessentially Italian book, one of the most popular or best-selling books in Italy. So I grabbed it because she talked about it and loved it, and because I am interested in Italy and Italian history. So I don't have immediate plans to get to it, but I would like to at some point. This is definitely something I found at that book sale, Daisy Faye and the Miracle Man by Fanny Flagg. I love fried green tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe, And several people said that this is another good book by her. So when I saw it at that book sale, I immediately grabbed it. And I don't have immediate plans to get to it. Bit of a library builder. It's like someday, actually, maybe now would be a good time. Maybe I need some Fanny Flag in my life now. I don't know. I'm going to think about that. But I do still definitely want to read it. Then we have On Canaan's Side by Sebastian Barry. Sebastian Barry was an author I had been really thinking about reading before going to Ireland. I didn't manage to fit him in. I do think there's a different book by him that I have on my shelf, and I'm blanking on the name of it. The one that involves the Civil War, and I don't remember the name of it, and I don't know if this was published before or after, so it doesn't matter. There's a different book that I would probably read first, but I consistently hear good things about him. This was at that book sale, so I grabbed it, threw it in my bag, and here it is. I'll probably do the other one first, but I'm going to hold on to this and read it at some point. Look at this beautiful old edition of Heartburn in hardcover by Nora Ephron. This is another really tiny book, and I can't remember if this is a first edition of it that I found at that book sale. It's not, but that doesn't matter. It's copyright 1983. This is just kind of a fun thing to have on the shelf. And again, don't have immediate plans to get to it, but this was super cheap. And because it's this is probably the original hardcover design in the United States. So just a cool thing to have. But I would like to read it, so it's kind of worth including. And the final book that fits our purposes for our revisit of November 2023 is True History of the Kelly Gang. I always want to say the True History of the Kelly Gang, and it's just True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey. I believe this is the book that won him a Booker. And, it opens with the map. I love a book that opens with the map. And I think this is a first edition. It's a first American edition, so functionally a first edition. So, cool thing to have. Again, no long-term plans to get to it, but I'm happy to have it. I've heard good things about it over the years. And if you're going to get it, why not this cheap first American edition of the book? So, that was all of... I'm actually going to move some of these because, I dropped Bless Me Ultima. The sun is kind of reflecting off of them into my eyes, so I don't want that. All right, so of the 17 books I brought into my library in November of last year that qualify for our purpose, I have only read 2, which is 12%. That's not good. That is not good at all. We're off to a terrible start, and it's just going to continue in that vein. I have not unhauled any of these books, however, and at the moment I don't plan to unhaul any of these books. So even though there are a lot, and a lot of these are library builders, like things that I don't have plans to get to right now, but maybe in the years coming I'll get to. So, like I said, a lot of them were purchased for cheap. The books that I spent the most on, far and away, were the first 3 that we covered. Witness, So Late in the Day, and The Lost Journals of Sacajewea. And, it's a start that I've read these 2. Let's move on to my book haul from November of 2022, which significantly smaller. As I said... All of the book hauls from previous years are a lot smaller. That sort of bucks the trend that most of my book haul revisits have. And here's where we get back to Claire Keegan, Foster, which I read and really liked. I am still one of the people who prefers small things like these, but a lot of people prefer Foster. Really great book. There's a movie adaptation we still haven't watched, even though it's available on Hulu in the United States. So I would like to get around to that. But great book. If you are unfamiliar with Claire Keegan, familiarize yourself with her. I am a huge fan. The price tag is still on the back. It's The Yellow Wallpaper and Other Stories by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I got it for $1.25. So again, compared to I bought Foster brand new for $20. Very different story. And this is so tiny, but anyway, it also doesn't take up a lot of room on my shelf. I haven't read this or any of the stories in it, but I would really like to at some point because I've never read it. And should be easy enough to fit in at some point. I don't have immediate plans to do it, but someday. Back in 2022, around this time, The Town of Babylon by Alejandro Varela was a contender for the National Book Award. Sounded really interesting to me. I have consistently thought about picking this book up, especially since it has this pink spine and it actually sits on my shelf right there. So when I'm working, I see it on my bookshelf. I will constantly think, I want to read that. So hopefully I will get around to reading it soon. We shall see, but I have not done it yet. And then the final book I brought into my library in November of 2022, you can guess why. The Seven Moons of Molly Almeida. Now, the question is, and I don't remember and I didn't go back to watch the book haul, did I purchase this before it won the Booker or did I purchase it after? I think I probably purchased it after it won the Booker. And I would still like to read it. I've heard very mixed things about it over the years. And I admit now that we've gotten so far away from it winning the Booker Prize, the urgency's gotten a lot lower. But I would still like to read it and it's not going anywhere. So I will be holding on to that. So that is 4 books that I brought into my library in November of 2022. And I have read one, Foster by Claire Keegan. That's 25%. Better, an improvement, but this is also a much smaller book haul, so it's not hard to move the needle on that percentage. But I haven't unhauled any, and I don't have plans to unhaul any. Like, I still want to read the 3 books that I have not read from that book haul. And that's something. It's definitely not nothing. Now we are going back to November of 2020. And I feel like I am missing a book. No, I'm not, because I unhauled it. We're getting to an unhaul. So the first book is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. She won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature that year. And I didn't really know about this book, but her speech really made me want to read this book. So I immediately ordered it and I have read it. I think did I end up listening to the audio? No, I think I read it in print. And I really liked this book. I also have A Scatter of Light, which is sort of a sequel. Not really. It's connected. It's sort of like in the universe of Last Night at the Telegraph Club. So I would really like to read that, but I have read this and it's great. I really liked this book a lot. So if you haven't read Last Night at the Telegraph Club, you might want to check it out. Then I got this graphic novel adaptation of Work Like Any Other by Virginia Reeves. This was done by Alex W. Inker, and this is actually French. Work Like Any Other had been longlisted for the Booker Prize. Oh, it's signed. I forgot to mention that. And I don't know who translated it because it's not on the cover. And it does. Okay, Montana Kane, I believe, is the person who translated it. Yeah, Montana Kane is the translator. They made it really difficult to find that information, which is a little disappointing. So apparently that novel was so popular in France that it became this graphic novel. And I like to work like any other, so I would like to read it. And I have thought about doing it because it should read very quickly, but I haven't yet. So still to be done. And then there was Plain Bad Heroines by Emily Danforth. That is a book that had been recommended to me by someone at Montana Book Company, and it sounded interesting. Emily Danforth wrote The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which I have read and liked. So I thought about it. And then Joel started, I think he finished Plain Bad Heroines and really did not like it. And I've gotten feedback from some other people that made me start to think, okay, but between Joel and these other comments, I feel like I'm totally fine letting this book go. So it has been unhauled. It's not here anymore. And I did not read it. So it hits my watch out criteria. I mean, however, at the time, how was I to know that Joel would read it and not like it, and that other people whose opinion usually aligns with mine would read it and not enjoy it? But it hits my watch out criteria. So of the 3 books from 2021, I have read 1. That is 33%. I've unhauled 1, which is 33%. And that 1 book hits my watch out criteria, which is unhauled without reading. So that's 1 out of 3, 33%. Again, 33% is the magic number for November of 2021. Now, let's head to November of 2020 now. I am not ashamed of the name of this book, but I am going to let you read the cover of it because I once got flagged in a video in which I didn't curse for language, and I had to do an appeals process, and it was overturned, but like, it was a whole thing, so I try not to curse on my channel. So this is a collection of the comics that made Alison Bechdel sort of a cult favorite before she wrote Fun Home, which is one of my favorite books of all time, and I have read this and enjoyed it. It's like a great time capsule into the queer, especially lesbian scene in the early 90s. And for that reason, I find it absolutely fascinating. So at least it's a success story. I have read it. Then there's A Promised Land by Barack Obama. And I fully admit, I should have read this when it came out. I've actually thought about unhauling it, but I don't want to unhaul Barack Obama's book. But yeah, this was a $45 book. Joel read it, but I haven't. And in hindsight, if I am going to read this book, I want to do the audio. I want to hear Barack Obama read it to me. But a lot has happened since November of 2020. So part of me just feels like, I don't know, the urgency is just kind of gone for this book, although I have heard really good things about it. So maybe I'll get around to reading it someday. It would probably be on audio. So even though it hasn't been unhauled, this kind of does fit my watch out criteria, because I spent $45 on a book that if I was ever going to read, I would read it on audio, not in print. This was really just to have a copy in my library. And I've kind of been thinking, like, do I actually need that? I don't know. Then there was Memorial by Brian Washington. I unhauled that and I did not read it. So it hits my watch out criteria. I had read by Brian Washington's first book, which was a story collection, and I really wasn't a fan. I sort of got talked into Memorial by people who were fans of it, but I've since heard some mixed things about it. And ultimately, I just decided I feel like I'm very unlikely to read this. So I released it to my local used bookstore in exchange for some credit, and it is gone. Appointment in Samara by John O'Hara is the final book for my November 2020. I found this fun older edition that is readable, by the way, at my local used bookstore, and it's something I still want to read. I have not gotten around to, but I feel like it would just be fascinating, because John O'Hara was a very wildly popular author in his time. He is still read, but definitely not as widely known, and I feel like he's almost like a cult favorite author now, where people are vaguely familiar. The people who know his work seem to really like it, but a lot of people just don't know who he is and probably haven't heard of Appointment in Samara. But Appointment in Samara was consistently listed on best books of the 20th century lists. So someday I will get around to reading it. Of the 4 books I brought into my library in 2020, I've read 1. Again, so that's 25% success rate. I've unhauled 1. That's 25%. And that unhaul was also a book I hadn't read. So that's 1 out of 4, 25%. 25% is the magic number for November of 2020. Let's get to the last year for this book I'll revisit, which is November of 2019. This one, it's not good. There were 4 books. 2 have been unhauled. First was The Great Pretender by Susanna Cahalan. I didn't look it up before I started filming. I honestly don't even remember what that book is about. That was when I was a member of Book of the Month Club, and part of the reason I let my membership go is that I ended up with a lot of books that I felt like I should use a credit, so I got something, but I wasn't actually really interested in reading, and this is kind of a perfect case in point for that. So it's gone. I didn't read it. And The Fountains of Silence by Ruta Sepetys. I was actually interested in reading that one, but I think the audio is available. So at some point I decided, I feel like if I'm going to read this, I will do it on audio. And that will be what it is. Now we get to some books I actually still have. Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. I loved Girl, Woman, Other. And then when I heard about the existence of this book, I had to order a copy of it. So here it is. And I have not read it, but I consistently think about reading it. It's been pretty much on my Pride Month pile of possibilities every year since I got it. So I'm really hoping to get around to, especially since there is an adaptation of it that is either out now or coming soon. So I would really much like to read it. Here's Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. We're going to close with this one. Now, Toni Morrison is in the Pulitzer family of authors, but I purchased this book before I started collecting every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and before I started also collecting other books by authors who have won the Pulitzer Prize. Like, she didn't win for Song of Solomon. She won for Beloved, and I did a video about that. It will be down below if you would like to see it. So I read it, and I loved it. I think, thinking as a critic, Beloved is the best Toni Morrison book. But for me personally, I think Song of Solomon is actually my favorite. I love it. It's really, really good. So we end on a note of success. So that's good. Of the 4 books I brought into my library in November 2019, I've read 1, 25%. I've unhauled 2, 50%. And I hadn't read either one of them. So that is also 50%. Overall, in all of these Novembers that we have looked back at, I have brought 32 books into my library. 17 of those were last year alone. Good thing I didn't go to the book sale this year. I have only read 6 of them. That's 19%. Now, when I do my book haul revisits, I kind of aim for a 50% success rate, and we're a long way from that. So this is November. I did really well in October. I'll link that book haul revisit down below if you'd like to go back and look at that. I did terribly in November. 19% out of 32 books is not great. It's not great at all. But I've also only unhauled 4 of those books, which is 13%. The problem is all 4 of those books had been unread. So that is also a 13% watch out rate. And my thinking is I want to keep my sort of watch out percentage at or below 15%. And we're very close to it. So November is not the best month for me in terms of book hauls and book haul revisits, which is interesting. If you have recommendations about which of these books you think I should prioritize, because I have not read many of them, let me know. If you have feedback about any of them, let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time. I hope this gave you some distraction this week. And until next time, happy reading.